Hello and welcome to another tutorial. Today we're going to be creating a really fun landscape using a mix of World Creator and Blender. This is a really fun one, and I'm going to go through a lot of different tips and tricks to generate these landscapes in World Creator, bring them over into Blender, texture them, light them properly, give some really awesome atmosphere to them, and then render them out and make them look realistic. So let's get right to it. So thank you so much for joining us for today's tutorial. I've got World Creator fired up right here, and you can see this software has a lot of different properties that you can adjust right off the bat. I like to make my landscapes seamless in the X and Z, just that you can tile them if you want, and then you can actually make a custom base shape. You can adjust the terrain size. I typically like to go for something with 4K dimensions, 4096 by 4096. And to edit the shape, there's a couple different ways to do this. I usually just use this little tool here where you can just drag up and down on these kind of diamond shaped things here. In this landscape in particular, I want a central feature like a large mountain front and center for us in the frame here. So I'm gonna just kind of sculpt these up manually, just pulling on the handles up and down. It's really quick and easy, and it's kind of fun to take your time and do this. And this is all procedural, by the way, too. So if you ever want to come back and adjust the base shape of these, you can easily just, come right back to this again, even after adding filters and adjusting the terrain a little bit further, using different kind of weathering techniques and effects. You can come right back to the shape and just continue to edit it. You can also continue to edit the terrain size if you wanted as well. If I wanted this to be larger, say like 8,192 by 8,192, feel free to do that as well. Generally, I feel like the 4K texture resolution works well too. To kind of orbit around here, it's a little bit different. I'm just using my mouse. You can hold down on the right mouse to kind of like orbit around and kind of scroll up and down a little bit. It's a bit different than Blender. It kind of, takes a second to feel out how to adjust your view of this as well. And zooming in and out is the same using the middle mouse button as well. So there's a couple other different actions you can do here to kind of smooth out your terrain. You can, flatten your entire shape if you want it as well. But for now, I'll be done editing this base shape. I've got this nice central mountain feature. And I'm going to go over to my favorite part, which is adding in filters. To add in filters, you can just choose all these different categories, and each one has these kind of sub filters as well. And you can see just what each one of these does if you just kind of click through. And I just encourage you to experiment with this and just see what works. I often just will accidentally stumble upon a really cool looking terrain just by kind of adding in different terrain effects to it. So I'm kind of liking this like little bit of flow pattern we're getting here. And I can always come back and adjust this as well too. You can also adjust the general strength of these if it's a little bit too much for you as well. And if you look in the bottom right of my World Creator window, you'll see this kind of like orangish yellow load bar. This does take it a second or two sometimes to just generate because these are, pretty graphics intensive effects at times, displacing the terrain here. It takes a little bit of compute power to work through. If you've got a stronger GPU, like I've got a Quadro RTX 5000 for this, it's generally very quick. This is not sped up at all. This is real time that you're seeing here. So it's really quick to kind of adjust these, and you can just kind of keep stacking them. So if you find one you like, so I like this one, I can just add it. This has added it to my terrain, and I can actually stack a second one on top to just really enhance this effect. I really like kind of the ridging that we're getting there. Now we can actually add on other effects. And if you see, we've got these side by side here now where you can see my filters that I've added in, and I can just continue to add more filters in. I'm kind of liking this canyon eroded effect, but I can pull the strength down quite a bit so it's not as strong when I'm blending these in together. This kind of just makes it a little bit more subtle. I can add that in. And then what I really like a lot about this is that you can just go right back, like I said, and adjust the base shape. So I'm noticing this central mountain's a little bit too sharp. So I'm just going to pull down on those handles just to kind of bring it down a little bit. You can see there's like a little bit of pixelization almost there. It's kind of getting a little bit too stretched out at the top. That's not looking too realistic to me. Maybe that's the effect you're trying to go for. By all means, go ahead and do that. But for this particular render, I don't want it to be too sharp. I want it to look photorealistic. I want to look as if you've gone for a hike. You come across this really cool mountain, and it's a super misty morning or evening, and you've taken a cool picture. So for now, done editing shape as well, and we can go right back to adding in more filters, just like that. Super easy. I'm just going to hit add, and then we can test out some of these sand-covered ones. I kind of like some of the details that we're getting in the kind of valley regions of this between these like sharp ridges. You've got like a little bit of graininess to it, which really adds that nice photorealistic subtle detail to the scene as well. All of this really goes a long way in the believability of your render as well. So I encourage you to just kind of keep stacking these layers, maybe pulling the strength down a bit as you see me doing here, and then just adding them in. Experimenting again with other different effects just to see what you can get. And again, this is just a lot of trial and error. There's no real, particular way to approach this, just other than just experimenting and testing out and seeing what works for your particular scene. As I always encourage with all of my renders and all of these tutorials, definitely consult references as well. If you don't really know what a mountain looks like, all these little details and stuff in the nooks and crannies of the valleys, look up some references. Go look up some images from some national parks like Yosemite, kind of see how a mountain, looks in real life. Try to get it from different angles, up close, far away, and then zoom in your world creator scene here, as you see me doing here, as I'm adding in like sediment and different kinds of filters like this, and see kind of how that would place itself in the terrain. This is really very, very simple to do, but it's often overlooked, just all these subtle little details here. So definitely take the time to really enhance that photorealism. And now that I've stacked 5 or 6 filters here, it's starting to run a little bit slower. You can see it's taken a couple seconds here on the bottom right to kind of process things, but still it's very responsive. It's very quick to do. And if I ever wanted to kind of pull this back just so it's a little bit quicker, you can always reduce that tile size as well. So it's maybe like a 2K resolution instead of 4K. That does change the base shape a bit, by the way. So, once you're ready to go back to your full resolution, you can kind of zoom back out that as well. There's some nice wind effects here too. I kind of like how this smoothed out just slightly. I do want it to be kind of sharp. I really like that kind of graininess, that gritty detail that we're getting, but just a very, very subtle wind. You can see I've really pulled that strength down quite a bit. It's kind of gone a long way for me. It's just smoothing out ever so slightly some of the kind of in-between regions of these valleys. It's looking really nice. And there's all kinds of other filter levels that I haven't even touched here that you can get into as well to kind of adjust strength on different kinds of scales of your render as well here. But this is looking pretty great off the bat. So, I can now actually move over to the texture workflow here. And we're actually going to create a texture in World Creator here and then kind of adjust it a little bit in Blender Shader Editor. I'm just going to give this a name. We can just call this like volcanic sand. I'm going to kind of want this to be kind of like an Icelandic looking mountain, where you have this kind of black sand from the volcanic mountains that are present there. And World Creator actually comes packaged with a bunch of these kind of default texture that you can mod a bit to your liking and kind of change up a bit as well here. So, I have this texture imported. Now I can go over the General tab, and if I were to zoom in on this, you can see it's really kind of funky looking because it's not tiling properly. You can see these really harsh edges. So you can start to add in Perlin normal noise to kind of smooth that out a little bit. It just kind of adds this subtle, like kind of different bright and dark regions to kind of make your texture blend a bit better. You can add some triplanar in there as well too, which also helps smoothing things out. And you can just straight up click this button that says eliminate tiling, which does a pretty good job too. Adjusting some of these other properties helps as well too. They kind of make subtle little details to the noise on that texture that you're getting as well, just to break up that uniformity. And now if I zoom back out, it looks a lot better. You can see this texture is like kind of zoomed in a little bit weird. So I'm going to adjust that when I go back to the texture scale of it. But this has already done a much better job at kind of making this texture, look a little bit better and tiled much better. And I really like that about World Creator and being able to do that. You can always come back and adjust these as well. Like I said, everything's procedural, slider based here generally. So it's really nice to kind of have that flexibility and just very simply present it to you as well. You can also go, if you have the tile size locked, just adjust one of these parameters. So if I adjust the X, it'll actually adjust the Z simultaneously too. So if I'm going to pull this scale really far down, I kind of like how that looks, and it takes me a while to zoom in to really start to see that texture because this is pretty large scale. You're not really going to see the subtle details. I mainly just want a slight variation in this kind of dark color across the region too. And I'm actually going to be adding in a gradient to this as well to further kind of break up this uniformity. I can use a height gradient and kind of adjust each of these by clicking on here and adding in different colors using a color picker. And this adds the different colors based on, as it implies, the height. So now this is adding to the lower kind of valley regions, this kind of dark greenish color, this kind of forest green. I can add in a second one to kind of start to blend that in a little bit better. Maybe lighten it up slightly here with kind of a middle region here, kind of this brownish green in between. And then, up at the top, I kind of want it to look like somewhat snow-capped, maybe this like nice grayish granite rock up at the top here of the mountain as well. And again, this is all very flexible, up to you. I encourage you to look up specific color palettes online. There's really great sites. There's one called Coolors. It's like, I think COOLORS. You can look up and find a really cool color palette and just experiment with a variety of different ones and see what works for you as well. Going down here, you can also adjust some other parameters kind of with the shininess of the texture. And I also like to adjust some stuff with the normal strength as well here too to kind of add like a little bit more grittiness to it. All that detail really comes out quite well when you're adding these textures into Blender as well. So this is looking great. You know, you've got a really nice scene here with a lot of variation in between the valley regions. You've got almost these kind of subtle craters here too, different ridges and stuff, and everything's looking very, very photorealistic already. And we're just kind of working off of World Creator. We're going to take this much further once we actually go into Blender itself and start playing around there. But, you know, I can always just go back and adjust these things as I see fit as well too. And I encourage you to take the time, you know, really slow stuff down and just experiment, just see what works for you, just to kind of play around with the software. So I can add in another texture layer. We're going to make this one kind of like a grassy one. And we're going to kind of want it to be, you know, flowing in as if it's part of this river delta or something, kind of going through. You can see this erosional pattern on the mountain that looks as if, you know, water or something has been eroding away at the rocks. So what I can do is actually go down, and if you scroll further down, let me just increase the normal strength a little bit on this as well. I can actually click on something called flow enabled here, which makes it as if it's kind of in the water, where water would be kind of in the valleys of this as well. That's a very strong effect. So we're going to kind of pull that back using a couple different noise layers and kind of smooth it out a little bit so it blends in a bit better. I also don't want it affecting the entire mountain. You can see it's going all the way up to the peak of this as well if I zoom in here, which I don't really like as well, because you can think it's a little bit sharp up there and the water probably wouldn't be flowing up there as much. It'd be probably a little bit tough for some plant life to be growing up there, since it'd probably be very cold up the top of the mountain compared to the, you know, the valleys where the waters kind of flow, the ice and stuff has kind of melted off the peaks down into this valley. So I can click on this height select feature here, and you can see it gives me this ability to smooth it out first of all, because there's that kind of harsh, you know, linear almost edge you can see around it. And to really kind of play that off a little bit more, you can actually, if I scroll down here a bit further, there's this height noise. And if I zoom in, you can see, you can actually add a little bit of noise to kind of smooth that out. And that just makes it a lot more believable too. Gets rid of that really hard linear edge that just doesn't look photorealistic. You really don't see, you know, anything that's perfectly linear in nature, especially with these mountains. There's always this sort of like fractal randomness to it, you know, from how you've had the rivers or water or rain eroding at the surface over millions of years. So I can adjust this color to kind of blend in a little bit better. I kind of want this nice saturated, somewhat green here. And you can see it's got this really interesting pattern developing in the valleys as well. There's almost this kind of like river flow pattern where you can imagine maybe over millions of years, water has been running through here. And this region's very fertile. It's got very nice kind of grassy regions to it as well, maybe some forest and stuff in there. And keep in mind, we're going to be looking at this from a distance too, so the detail doesn't have to be too crazy. Maybe I'd go a little bit more detailed with this if it was a closer up view. But this is as if we're kind of looking, you know, through a telescope, you know, at this mountain from a distance. You're flying over it in a helicopter or looking at it from a different peak. So I can adjust some more of these texture features as well here. And again, I encourage you to just play around, see what these little subtle details do for your render as well. Each one of these things does just add a subtle bit of noise. You can blend it in a little bit better using this weight slider here at the bottom as well too. So it's just a lot of fun to really quickly get these kind of looking nicer and looking blended in. And then once you have something that you like, you can actually start to export these maps out. So first I export the terrain height map in EXR format. You can just export that out. Then export the normal map out as well. PNG format's just fine for this. Then you can go over to the textures tab here, and you can actually export the color map, which will look like that. And then I'm also going to pull the roughness map as well. And that'll be good for us for our texture setup here as well. So I'll just export that out. And if we go on over into Blender, you can actually switch over to cycles and GPU compute. And I'm going to be using cycles experimental for this as well, just so we can actually displace our terrain directly from the texture, from the shader itself. So just setting up some properties here, we got some denoising as well, switch to experimental. I'll just add in a plane and give it some subdivisions just so we have some geometry for our shader to work with. You know, something like 100 cuts is fine for now, because I'm also going to be adding in a subdivision surface on top of it with adaptive checked on. And let me just show you first what I would typically do. You can add a displace, you know, set it to UV and open up your EXR displacement texture, which is all well and good. However, it's pretty intensive, and I really like actually doing this from the shader, just because I feel like you've got a little bit more flexibility this way of kind of blending stuff in a bit better. Unfortunately, it doesn't show in the viewport when you're doing this. It will just show up in rendered mode, but we're going to have a window up with the render anyway. And if you've got Node Wrangler enabled, you can just hit Control Shift and T, select all of your textures, and then Blender will automatically connect them all for you using Principal Texture Setup, which is great. So we've got all of our nodes properly plugged in. The one thing you're going to have to do is go down to Settings in the Shader tab and switch to Displacement and Bump in the Settings properties there. Now if I switch over to render, you see we're actually displacing that terrain. This only shows in rendered mode, as I said there. And I'll just change the mid-level to 0 so that it's right on our XY plane right there too. It's a little bit too sharp in terms of the displacement, so just kind of dialing that back down to like 0.6 works a little bit better, I think, for this. And I'm going to be using a really cool add-on called Physical Starlight and Atmosphere to light this one as well. Feel free to use an HDRI. I just really like this add-on a lot because of the flexibility of adding in really cool atmospheric effects that are really photorealistic because they're actually based on real atmospheric data, atmospheric fall-off, in scattering and everything like that. It really looks beautiful, and they've actually added in this new procedural clouds feature that we can use as well. I'll ultimately be adding in a different background, but this just gives me a lot of flexibility over the lighting control as well. Just kind of adjusting my camera so that we're looking at this mountain a little bit closer up. Let's make it like a 24mm focal length so that it's kind of more wide angle, taking in the glory of this huge mountain here in our scene. And eventually I'm actually going to switch this over to Instagram resolution, which is this vertical 1200 by 1500 pixel view through this. But for now, this is, a pretty good start. It's looking pretty great. And we can just kind of adjust things and move it around to see fit. And now over in the Physical Starlight Atmosphere properties, you can actually adjust the elevation of our sun, the azimuth, kind of like this rotation directionality where it's coming from. And it's just a sun lamp that you're actually manipulating just through the sliders here in the world properties, which is really awesome. So it's really quick and easy to do this and kind of make this look believable with just a couple clicks. You can see our texture is not looking as detailed as I'd want, so I'm going to crank up the normal just a little bit so we've got a little bit more kind of bumpiness to it. And then we can also make some adjustments with the specularity so it's not quite as shiny, plasticky looking. You see if I pull it all the way down to 0, it kind of brings back the saturation of our texture. So I can play with that quite a bit too, just to make it, a little bit more believable, look a little bit nicer. So this is something I'll keep playing with as well. I can also adjust the roughness a little bit too. Typically what I like to do is throw a color ramp in between the roughness and the principal BSDF node and just kind of crunch the sliders a little bit together so that it's kind of a shorter fall off here. I even switched to easing it, so it's kind of a little bit more of a slide between here. And so this is already looking pretty great. We've got a nice scene here coming together. There's a lot more that we can do though. So I can actually ramp up the density here, which just kind of makes it, a foggier, mistier atmosphere. And this is kind of the effect I'm going for. I want it kind of an early morning, misty effect, very nice and pink clouds, kind of this beautiful sunrise coming up through the valley here, reflecting off of our peaks. And, I can just move my camera around here super simply and make this happen as well, which is really nice. So yeah, it's just, quick and simple to just kind of play around with this a bit as well, just to see what effects you get. I'm always changing the camera view as well here. This is something I like to come back to quite a bit. It's always helpful to also enable the different overlays as well too, so that kind of the rule of thirds, where things are centered. And I'm just changing the resolution here so that it's now a vertical view here as well, which requires me to kind of adjust my camera view quite a bit here as well. And I want this kind of centered up so that the sky takes up about a third. The kind of midsection there with the mountain takes about a third, and then this valley in the foreground takes up a third as well. So to kind of adjust that, I click on the overlays, go down to the camera, and that can actually adjust the viewport display composition guides to show me the rule of thirds and center. And you can see I'm just slightly off center here, so I just wanted to center up that mountain as well. And now I can turn off overlays, and that's looking pretty great. Back into the settings in Physical Starlight and Atmosphere, I can do quite a bit of adjustments here with the ground. I was noticing that the sky was kind of not quite down below the mountains. You're kind of seeing this weird grayness at the bottom, so that just allowed me to just adjust a bit better. And then I also brought the elevation down here as well to kind of get more of a reddish, orangish hue on the mountains to kind of match that early morning effect that I was going for. Adjusting the azimuth to have a different rotation so that the sun is coming in from the left of the frame. And this is looking really nice too. We've got a really beautiful light kind of splattering onto our scene. I'm noticing it's quite dark. I do like kind of this splash, but I'm going to add in a sun lamp just to further enhance the directionality of this light, cast some more shadows on our surface, and really show all of those details that we put into World Creator in the first place. We put those in for a reason. We do want to show them off, right? So I just match the sun's rotation up, generally with the starlight sun as well. And I'm just going to crank that strength up a bit. And we can also give it a little bit of color too here. I kind of want to give it a little bit of, a sunset kind of sunrise glow to it as well. And I just kind of play around with it to see where the shadows fall the best on my terrain, generally trying to match the directionality of our starlight sun as well. But, just getting it as close as possible to something I like. I don't want the strength to be too much because it starts to kind of wash out our scene, make it look not as realistic as well, unfortunately, too. So just kind of adjusting that and then going back in and playing around with the density and other parameters as well to kind of get something that we want. is looking great. Having this purplish tone as well to the sky really adds in such an interesting effect as well. You can even add in some procedural stars and adjust the clouds too. Like I said, I'm probably going to end up just swapping out this background anyway, but for now it's helpful just to see the color as well, just to get an idea of what the scene looks like. It's a little bit too shiny, so I'm going to go back into the specularity, adjust that a little bit, adjust my color ramp settings, and just give it a little bit more bumpiness in the normal map as well. And I'm always playing around with these. I'm always coming back to my settings, adjusting things as well. Really take the time always throughout. Lighting is essential for any render. It's always so important to come back here and make sure that it looks prim and proper. So I always go back through and adjust the lighting settings. And I'm just going to add in some volumetrics here to really bring the scene together and kind of add that haziness as well. If you're in the early morning, there's often some mist rolling through the valleys, and I really want to create that effect. First here in Blender, give me a nice starting base to work from. And then later on in Photoshop, really enhancing that effect with some brushes and stuff like that as well will give us some really cool effects. So using a principled volume for this, I'll just hook the volume up into the volume, and it'll take a second to load up usually. And there's the effect. It's way too extreme right off the bat at the current density. So you can actually brighten it up a bit, and it kind of brings back some of our detail as well. I'm just going to saturate it with some pinkish yellowish color as well. And then we can go into our sun lamp, and this is really where the volumetrics come alive. You can give it a little bit more color, so kind of this pinkish color to match the volumetrics, and then really crank up that scale. You see we've got a really nice effect here. This has got some really nice fall off. It gets really hazy as we get further back, but we still see those really great details from the mountains as well. Crank up the specularity just to show you what that looks like, and then bringing that back down and bring back the richness and the saturation of our grass. And that's looking really, really beautiful to me. That's got some really nice detail that we worked through in World Creator, coming through really well. But we've also got that kind of mysterious atmospheric fall off to the scene as well. Really, really beautiful and coming together quite well already with just a couple clicks here. Again, going back in and adjusting the lighting, we can crank it up a little bit more to see what effect that has as well. There's some really nice brightness coming in from the left side of the frame that we can play around with a little bit more. And I'm just going to actually duplicate this plane, click on that number 2 there to make a kind of a linked duplicate texture too. And then that allows me to adjust the normal settings. That allows me to adjust the displacement just for a second here, turning off the volumetrics just to see the background a bit better. I can move this plane around here just to kind of put it behind there. And you can see I'm really cranking up the normal map here as well. Scaling it up actually in edit mode as well too here, just to see what this looks like. Effectively, what I'm trying to go for is just to have some hint of a mountain range here as well, as if this is not, the only isolated mountain here. There is some mountain detail behind, even if it doesn't really come through the volumetrics as well. It'll still be there, and there might be some shadows that are interesting that are cast from it onto our foreground terrain here as well. And going over in the displacement, you can adjust the scale here really quickly, and now we can see it appearing behind our render as well. It's matching a little bit too closely the directionality of this. So it is the same texture, it is the same displacement here, but just kind of rotating it around, scaling it up, makes it look different enough for your eye at first glance. As you're looking at this, you can't necessarily tell that that's the same exact displacement map, especially once we kind of scale it down like this, blend it in a little bit better, move it around, scale it up. That looks like an altogether different mountain there. And duplicating it once more, and then we can just click on that number 2 button as well if you wanted to duplicate this as well, but I'll keep it the same because it just doesn't really matter as much. And let's just turn on the volumetrics again, and that's looking really awesome. We do have a slight hint of some kind of shadowing. It's very, very subtle, and that is intentional. I don't want stuff to be too powerful here in the background. Usually what I like to do is group up layers at this point too, just as stuff starts to get a little bit heavier. Group all these together, my mountains, group my main sunlight and my starlight into a main lighting tab, and we can give it some color too. I'll give this an orange color for the lighting. And then I'm actually going to add in some point lights to really enhance some of the details in the valleys. We're kind of losing that a little bit with this fog that we have put in here. So just adding in some subtle points just to bring a little bit more backlighting to these things will really enhance it. And again, very, very subtle here. You can see how small the radius and the power. I just cranked this up a lot just to show you how overwhelming that is. If you really crank up the power too much, it's just going to wash out your entire scene. But kind of adjusting this a bit, I'm putting this way back in the background too, so the power actually does need to be a bit brighter just so that it actually reads well. But that just kind of further enhances the sunlight effect coming in from that left side of the frame. We can also group this point light up in a collection because we're going to add a couple of these in. And I'm just going to duplicate this one, move it around, and just see how it will factor in well to my scene. Placing it on the right side of the mountain is a little bit too much. I do want this to match the lighting, like I said, generally from our main lighting, that's starlight and the sun. So I kind of adjust these and give it a little bit of hue as well, just so that it brings out that morning glow a little bit better. And I do want some lighting in the foreground here too, but not that much. This is obviously way too much here at 1000 watts. So I'm gonna bring the radius down and really bring down the power quite a bit. I experiment first with 100 watts, but I ultimately, I think, went for something even smaller than that, like maybe 10 watts or something, just because you can see how overwhelming that is. That just has washed out our entire scene. And I want this to be a very subtle touch, just to give a little bit of contrast to our scene as well, and kind of break up the two-dimensionality of this and make it look a little bit more three-dimensional as well. We want to give it some depth as well. And that's very important. Once you're adding in volumetrics, it does remove a lot of depth from your scene, just as much as it adds such huge contrast between the light and dark regions. It really does wash out a lot of elements. So you kind of do have to add in sometimes this subtle lighting just to it's so subtle here. You can see literally 1 watt for that one there. It's so subtle, but it really does make a difference. Take the time to do this as well too. Just make sure it's not too overwhelming and pull things back in and scale it back in. Generally, like I've said for a lot of my tutorials, I generally will just use an HDRI with a sun lamp or something like that. Sometimes you do need to go just the extra step just to get a little bit more detail back from your scene as well. Sometimes you need to return your texture too. You can see it's a little bit too shiny for my liking. It looks a little bit too plasticky, which I don't like. I want it to be a little bit rougher. You can go back and adjust that as well. I can also adjust some stuff with the displacement just to add in a little bit more detail as well with the subdivision, or remove some if it's a little bit too intensive for you with your system. Just kind of be mindful of this as well. So that's great to do as well. Just kind of adjusting those settings just to make sure it works for your system. So we're getting pretty close to the end here. This is a point when I just kind of assess my references as well, look through stuff and see how things are working for the real world out there. How do mountains actually look? How does, morning haze actually look as well? And then return to my render and just adjust settings here as well. You could hit render at this point. I might add just a little bit more color in just to bring out those greens just a bit more, or just a wee bit more here. And to do that, I'm just gonna add in an RGB and mix it with a mix RGB with our base color. And you can throw some overlays on here as well too. So if I plug this color into the bottom socket, give it a little bit of kind of like a lime green effect to it, and then blend a bit with these adjustment layers, the different blending modes. You can kind of see what different effects. Obviously that looks terrible. It looks like, I don't know, seaweed colored or something like that. But really making this subtle, maybe adjusting it so it's a blending screen, and just really pulling the factor down so that we're almost seeing just the original base color coming through. Works pretty well. Bringing that brightness down a bit more. I'm just trying to add in just a subtle wash of green here just to bring some of that back, because we did lose a little bit, like I said, adding in the volumetrics to our scene. We kind of desaturated our image quite a bit. So bringing that back in really just kind of takes it the next step just to make it a little bit better too. Again, this is just a personal preference. You don't have to do this. This is just something I like to do sometimes to adjust the color at the last second here before we hit F12 to render our image out. So it's getting pretty close to the end here. So you could call it always there. So I have fun with this as well, just messing around with the texture settings and different things like that, just personal preference. And I'm also just setting up my render settings as well. So for this one, I just use an optics denoiser, which I tend to like for my renders when you're putting them out. It just gets rid of some of the noise, and especially with volumetrics, you're often gonna get a little bit of noise in there just by nature. Volumetrics will add in a lot more noise generally. So having this optics checked on with enough samples to give you a good starting point and base works quite well for the scene. I'm just gonna scale that volumetric up just a bit more so that it covers the extent of our scene on the right. I was noticing it was kind of clipping a bit. And this is probably pretty good. So you can just hit render on this at this point, get something going, and then we can return back into the compositor and just add some subtle adjustments to this to take it to the next step. So I have rendered this out, and I can hit use nodes here in my compositor, and then just hit Control Shift left click on that, and then it adds in a viewer node so we can actually see what we're doing in the compositor too. Just kind of moving things around so we've got a better view. I'm gonna add in a glare node off the bat. This is very subtle. Just gonna give me a little bit of extra fog glow. We've already have a lot of fog with our volumetrics to begin with, so this isn't really too big a deal. But you can see if I crank up that mix all the way up, you can see it's only affecting that one little bright region there where the sun is. So I just wanna add a subtle little wash glow to it. I'm gonna add in a lens distortion just to kind of simulate what a camera would look like, clicking on fit, and then just giving a little bit of dispersion. And if I really crank this effect up, you can see what it does. It kind of distorts our image and adds almost like a chromatic aberration, if you will, to it. So it kind of simulates a bit more of kind of this almost burn on the edges that cameras have, especially digital cameras. There's oftentimes this weird chromatic aberration that you get. So this simulates a little bit more of that photorealism, obviously, having that subtle thing. It's very subtle here, just 0.01. I don't want it to be too extreme because it will look really garbage if you do that. And I'm just going to sharpen it just a slight bit. You can see that's way too much. Everything is very subtle, very touch of things here too. And you'll see once I get over into Photoshop and start editing a little bit more, just keeping things incredibly subtle is the way to go. So now over in Photoshop, I like to start off with the levels adjustment and just kind of add some more contrast to our image to really draw your attention to the midground here, where our hero is, this central peak mountain with the beautiful morning sunrise glow off its left edge there. We do still want to have some of that detail from the foreground, so I keep the midtones, generally where they are, kind of shift them down a little bit, and then add a brightness and contrast in on top as well too. We can add a slight bit more contrast. And then I'm using an image for a sky here from Unsplash. It's a free site. I've linked it in the description if you want to use that as well. Find your own sky images. And then I just blend this in using some different adjustment layers here too. I can isolate the sky from my original layer, and I use some brushes sometimes to kind of smooth this out, get rid of the landscape that's below it, and just experiment a bit with the blending modes here as well, just to see which one works best for me. Generally, like overlay or soft light tends to work pretty well for these skies. Scaling it up a little bit so it matches the scene as well works for me too, just kind of playing around with that. And then I'm just going to isolate the sky using the select sky. And we can actually mask this out and have two layers. So what I'm going to have is the layer with no sky on top, and then the base layer beneath it. And then we're going to put the beach sky here that we have from Unsplash in between the two. And then we can blend it in just a bit better here so that it's only blending on top of the sky, just in case we missed anything. You can see we might have missed, some parts around the mountain there potentially. So just kind of shifting these layers around a bit and then using the blend modes just, kind of helps me out a bit more getting stuff working. You can see I kind of messed, I got a little bit confused somehow putting things in the wrong order, but eventually I figured it out. So that's the layer on top with no sky, and then the layer on the bottom, and that's what I want here. Now I can hit the blending mode, set it to something like lighten or screen for this one. Maybe lighten works pretty well. And then adjusting the opacity too, because right now it's a little bit too saturated. You can also just add in adjustment layers only tailored to that specific layer. So I can add a brightness layer and snap it so that it's only affecting the layer directly beneath it, which is that sky layer. And just kind of dial stuff in here a little bit so it matches the colors more for my scene. It's very important to make sure that this matches, obviously, because it's coming from externally. We're putting this in, we're compositing this in. We want it to blend well. We don't want it to look like it stands out, like the colors are really harsh and that the sun is coming from a different direction. So just always keep that in mind when you're adding in different stock images to your scenes. Keep in mind the directionality of the sun. You want to make sure that stuff is matching up properly, that the shadows aren't going the wrong way in your scene and that stuff is actually lining up. So if you need to, sometimes you can flip stuff horizontally. If stuff is coming from the different direction, the sky is differently aligned from your render. So just be mindful of that as well. And it's very obvious. It stands out immediately. If you see a render where the sky is flipped the wrong direction from where the light should be coming from, the shadows are in the wrong direction. So just be mindful of that as well. So I add in some hue saturation, just kind of adjust some properties here too, just to get things working properly. Generally, this is a quick process for me just to kind of blend the sky in here. And I just, like I said, take a lot of time with each of these sections just to really go through each of the adjustment layers and make stuff work, and then really pull the effect down. So I usually start going extreme and then kind of pull back in, keep pulling back in, just to get it so that it's not too intense, any of these effects. So adding in curves here just to add a little bit more contrast in. But again, it's very subtle. You'll see I'm just giving it ever so slightly an S curve here. I don't want to go overboard because it can very quickly look fake. It can very quickly look over-edited. And that's, again, one thing that really stands out to me when I'm seeing beginners renders particularly, is that you kind of push stuff a bit too far. You go over-edit a little bit too much. And sometimes it's just a subtle touch is all it takes to really bring your scene to life. And I'm just going to add in some fog here. I've got some brushes that I've downloaded as well. There's like a pack of free fog brushes. And what you can do is just, rescale the brush a bit so that it's not so massive for your scene. And then give it some color too. So that was initially blue, but I'm going to actually try to match the color of this sky, kind of this pinkish yellow color. Just color pick from somewhere there. Doesn't really matter too much. And then we can just click to add that in. Give it some blending, blend it to screen. And then I'm just going to scale this up a bit and then blend it in a bit more with our terrain. I really like how this is looking. This brush in particular actually works very well for the geometry of our scene. We've got this kind of fog in the base front valley, and then some kind of, isolating or circling around that second peak before the main one in the distance. And I can actually just use adjustments here to kind of further tailor it to where I want it to be, just relabeling this and bringing the opacity down. I don't want this affecting entirely where this is. I do want to have some darkness, so you can kind of dodge and burn a bit. by using like another brush. I'm going to just use a cloud brush here as my brush tool, and then just kind of paint back in where I want the, the darker regions of here to be too. So you can imagine that these are kind of low clouds somewhere in the valley, just right above, the canopy of trees floating through the horizon. So just kind of subtly painting stuff back in. And then using this cloud brush is really nice and quick and simple to pull stuff back in and add a little bit more of that detail too. So already this is looking great, pretty close to being done. I often will make a couple more minor changes at this point here too, a couple more adjustment layers. And again, I encourage you to just take your time here. There's no, specific regulations you need to follow here when adjusting this, besides just not going overboard. Again, always look back at your references if you think stuff is looking weird. Look at images from photographers to see, how they've captured and edited stuff in Lightroom, just to see how, oftentimes their work is often over edited sometimes too, photographers. So it can give you an idea for ways to go, but oftentimes you'll see even just their techniques too of how they've decided to edit an image, bring back clarity, highlight certain details. You can treat this as if it is a photograph. At this point, you're effectively editing a picture that you've taken. You're looking at a landscape image. How do you edit a landscape image, but retain that kind of imperfection to it as well? And that's kind of where a lot of the dodging and burning comes in, to highlight certain details, to hide other ones. And so it's kind of a push-pull process. You can see I'm adding in some color lookups just to kind of give an overall splash of design to it as well. So there is our scene. It's really coming together. It's really quick and easy. I like to sometimes add in like a lens flare overlay here, just to go on top of the volumetrics here, just to give a bit more of a filmic camera look to it, as well as if, this lens flare is coming through your camera. You're taking a picture directly looking into the sun. You're getting a little bit of this, imperfection of the lens flare affecting your camera viewpoint. And I'll often just scale this up so it kind of makes sense with our scene. You can see the sun's coming in from the left there, and just giving it some blending generally works pretty well for it. Sometimes you'll have to get rid of those harsh edges. You can see there's some kind of harsh edges on the top and bottom there. So just painting that out and then adjusting a little bit the blending gets it to where I want it to be as well. So that's looking pretty nice. I kind of don't like how the green and blue layer look there, but everything else, looks pretty good to me. And just turning that on and off to see what effect it has. It's subtle, but it does, bring the image a little bit closer to something that's photorealistic as well too. So looking great. Maybe a little bit more saturation. I sometimes pull down the vibrance first, push the saturation, and that is looking pretty beautiful to me. We've got a really nice landscape image, and it was pretty quick and simple. So this file is actually available on my Patreon as well, which you can see linked there in the bottom of your screen. It's also linked in the description if you just want to click there too. And I tend to release a lot of these types of landscape project files on there as well. I just released another one this week as well if you want to see that too. And I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. It was a fun one to go through creating this in World Creator. I can't wait to see what you create as well.